Chapter 30 of The Big Midget Murders by Craig Rice. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. Everything was okay, Malone told himself. Everything was going to be swell. He glanced at himself in the mirror beside the entrance to the casino. A fine figure of a man, he told himself. That new Finchley suit really did him proud. The wallet in his pocket was a reassuring bulge against his ribs, and he was meeting Ruth Rawson any minute now. It was true there were a few odds and ends of things to settle, just a little matter of finding out who'd murdered the midget, a mere trifle, and making sure that Max Hook didn't decide he was going to own the casino, not Jake, or that Von Flanagan didn't close up the casino at this crucial time. Nothing really for a man like himself who had a date with Ruth Rawson to worry about. Why, there was the nice fat fee he'd get from Lou Goldsmith just as soon as he'd attend to the item of finding the defendant. Everything was hunky-dory. He took one more glance at himself in the mirror and wished he could convince himself that all those things were true. His tie was beginning to creep toward one ear, and there were cigar ashes on the vest of the Finchley suit. Von Flanagan had said 12 hours, and 9 of them were left now. He wondered what Jake had been able to do about tonight's show. "I'm expecting a young lady to meet me," he told the head waiter. "A Miss Rawson." The head waiter's eyebrows didn't even quiver, let alone lift. "Yes, Mr. Malone?" "Show her to a table," he hesitated. "A corner table. Rosy lights and a secluded corner. And then page me." He went on into the casino. It was early, but the crowd was there. Far across the room he saw Helene sitting alone and headed for her. She looked up at him, smiled, and both of them said simultaneously, "Where's Jake?" Malone sat down, ran a finger under his collar, and this time both of them said, "Don't you know?" The lawyer waved to a waiter and said, "Let's start this dialogue from the beginning. You're supposed to say, 'Where's Jake?' and I'm supposed to say, 'I'll give you 3 guesses.' Or I'm supposed to say, 'Where's Jake?' and then you—" He paused to say to the waiter, "A double rye, a glass of water, and a soda cracker." The waiter said, "Yes, Mr. Malone," without any sign of surprise, and went away. Helene raised one eyebrow. "The soda cracker?" "Dinner," Malone said. "I haven't had time." He looked hopefully toward the door. Any minute now, when that head waiter came in, he'd usher a red-gold blonde in a white dress to a corner table and start looking over the room for him, Malone.
"Jake called up at the hotel," Helene said. "He said to come on down here tonight and he'd meet me. He said everything was okay."
"He's right," Malone said. "Everything's gonna be swell." He nibbled the soda cracker, took a sip of the water, and then looked at Helene over a glass of rye. Her pale green silk jersey dinner dress reminded him somehow of Lake Michigan on a clear day. Her perfectly composed face was pale and exquisite and smooth, and her corn silk color hair was like satin. "He's a very lucky guy," Malone said, "even if he does lose this joint."
"But he mustn't," Helene said. "Malone—"
"I know," Malone said. "I've got to find out who murdered the midget. And in a little less than 9 hours, too. How's Annette Guinness?" There were still those important questions he had to ask her.
"She's backstage dressing," Helene said. "She still feels a little shaky, but I think she'll hold out."
She puffed at her cigarette and said,
"I wish I knew where Jake could be."
"Shut up," Malone said. "The show's starting." He promised himself he wouldn't watch the door, but he took one more glance. Oh well, Ruth Rawson would be along any minute now. He lit a cigar, leaned back in his chair, and looked over the casino. If Jake could keep this up for just a few more nights, he'd be in the clear. There was a crowd again tonight, and scattered through the crowd he saw familiar faces. Penn Reddick, sitting at a table by himself. Betty Royal, her eyes sparkling, surrounded by 5 adoring young men. Ned Royal at another table in deep and earnest conversation with a slightly overdone brunette. Through the doors that led to the bar, Malone looked, started, and looked again. Hunched over the bar, a pair of heavy shoulders that could belong to no one but Lou Goldsmith. He looked away quickly and saw Max Hook at a shadowed table near the wall, wearing a tuxedo which appeared in this light to be a deep violet, 3 shadowy and indistinguishable figures lined up against the wall behind him. Malone turned his head again, only to see, at a special floor-side table, Von Flanagan, viewing the floor show with the critical eye of a fellow artist. The chorus, including Annette Guinness, still looked a little pale, and a hastily recruited girl to fill the place left vacant by Mildred Goldsmith finished the opening number. The light changed, and Al Omega's band struck up the melody that announced Angela Dahl. She too seemed a trifle pale. Still, she had recovered in time for tonight's show, Malone reflected, and that was something Jake had to be thankful for. He cast one more wistful glance toward the entrance. Oh well, it was still early. The chorus came back for its second routine, the South American number. Malone glanced at the long silk stockings and glanced away quickly. Good thing they had had plenty of spares. 11 members of the chorus there, and 1 substitute. 11 pairs of silk stockings, and 1 pair. That wasn't the thing he was searching for in his mind, he told himself. That wasn't the tip-off. It was something else. Helene said, "Jake," in a breathless voice. Malone looked up to see the tall, red-haired man sitting down at their table. He hadn't changed his clothes, and his face was pale and haggard from lack of sleep, but there was a hope and gleam in his eyes. "Everything's okay," Jake announced. "Everything's going to be swell."
"The show?"
Helene said. "It's all set," Jake said. "At least, I hope it's all set." He ran a hand through his tousled hair. "Don't ask me questions now. I'm still out of breath." He looked at Helene and said, "How anyone has the right to look so beautiful with so little sleep."
"How anyone can get away with looking so terrible," she said affectionately, "just because he's lost a night's sleep."
She looked at him critically and said,
"Jake, you're wonderful. And straighten your tie."
Jake straightened his tie, ordered a drink, and looked around the room. A nice house. He looked at Max Hook, at Von Flanagan, and then, hopefully, at Malone. "I'll fix it," Malone promised, wondering how he'd do it and when Ruth Ralston would arrive. The chorus finished the South American number and vanished. The lights dimmed a little. Jake downed his drink, leaned forward, and whispered, "Now, watch." The orchestra was silent. Then the pianist began to play, simply and not too well, the Skater's Waltz. The curtains parted, and from between them appeared Allswell McJackson, in a full dress suit that didn't fit him any too accurately, carrying a silk hat, which was obviously too small. He stood there for a moment on the tiny platform just above the dance floor, blinking at the audience as though he were wondering what to do next. Helene said, "Jake!" Malone didn't trust himself to speak. Von Flanagan, at his floor-side table, applauded wildly. "I shall try," Allswell McJackson said in his polished accent, "to entertain you with a few tricks." He came down onto the floor, almost tripping over the step, and drew a pack of cards from his pocket. The audience giggled. Allswell McJackson picked a plump gentleman at a floor-side table. "Will you be so kind, sir, as to select a card? Any card at all, sir, any card." Obviously, he was sweating to perform the trick exactly as the book had directed him. Somehow, though, when he was riffling the cards, they seemed to explode in his hands, spraying across the floor and landing him stomach-side down across the plump gentleman's table, one card still in his hand. "That's the one!" the plump gentleman said loudly. The audience howled, all save Von Flanagan, who looked on in a disapproving silence. Allswell McJackson ducked backstage, returning with a derby hat. "Ladies and gentlemen, the question has long been raised as to which came first, the hen or the egg. Tonight," by some miracle, the egg bouncing from the hat just missed the piano player, who continued to play the Skater's Waltz. Allswell said, "The wrong kind of egg." The audience howled again. The act of burning up the dollar bill turned out even better, especially when Allswell McJackson not only burned up the wrong envelope, but nearly set fire to his coattails in doing so. The climax came, however, when Al Omega's band struck a loud chord, and Allswell McJackson announced that, having produced an egg without the aid of a hen, he would now produce a hen without the aid of an egg. The hen, the same Rhode Island red, was still uncooperative. Halfway through the trick, Allswell paused to apologize that it really should be done with a tame hen. And by the time the hen had gotten away, been chased around the dance floor by the tall, gawky man, finally caught by one leg, and then lulled into an amiable clucking, the crowd was helpless, gasping, and applauding.
"Jake," Helene said, "you're a genius."
Allswell McJackson took his curtain calls with the hen in his arms. Al Omega's band vanished backstage, and Ramon Arriba's band began to play. The crowd began to spill onto the dance floor. "He may never be able to repeat himself," Jake said, lighting a cigarette. "But it sure solved the problem of tonight's show." Malone finally caught his breath. He couldn't do it, he said, if he were about 12 feet tall. Helene stared at him. "I dreamed that." "You what?" Malone said. "Oswald McJackson. I dreamed of him doing a magic act and stopping in the middle of it to say, 'I couldn't do this trick if I weren't 12 feet tall.'" Malone started to speak, but there was an influx of congratulatory customers around Jake's table. Penn Reddick, a sports reporter from the Times, Betty Royal and one of her young men, a City Hall hanger-on, a society woman from Highland Park, and, at the tail end of them, Von Flanagan. The little lawyer took advantage of the moment's confusion to slip away for a word with the head waiter. No, the lady hadn't arrived yet. Yes, he would inform Mr. Malone immediately. By the time Malone returned to the table, the customers had vanished, and Jake and Helene were alone. "Well, that's that," Jake said. He lit a fresh cigarette and said, "Now, Malone, if you'll only—" He paused. "You know, Von Flanagan wasn't fooling." He paused again. "If you don't—" "Don't worry," Malone said confidently. "Just leave everything to me. I'm not just your lawyer, I'm your pal." He emptied his glass and said, "We're like brothers. We're closer than brothers." His voice seemed to catch in his throat on the last word. His eyes met Helene's across the table for a long moment. "What the hell?" Jake said. "What's the matter with you two?" "Nothing much," Malone said very quietly. He turned to look at Jake. "Except that Helene and I know who murdered the midget." End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Big Midget Murders by Craig Rice. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31. When Malone said a thing like that, he didn't fool. Jake said, "Who?" and "How do you know?" all in the same breath. Malone answered the last question. "You may not remember it, but you told me." He drained his glass and stood up. "What are you going to do?" Helene asked. "I'm going to collect my other $2,000, Malone said. He lit a fresh cigar and looked around the room. Suddenly, he said, "I'm afraid we'll have to move fast. I've got a hunch." Without another word, he headed for the door that led backstage. Jake and Helene followed him, Helene flinging a dark green woolen cape over her pale shoulders. At the door to what had been the midget's dressing room, the lawyer paused. "I may be wrong about this," he said. "I hope that I am." He threw open the door. Oswald McJackson lay sprawled on the floor just below the spot where the midget's tiny body had hung. There was a noose of ordinary rope around his neck, and another strand of rope was fastened to the overhead bar. "The rope broke," Malone said. "He was too heavy." He knelt down beside the big man. Jake said, "Damn it, it's a conspiracy against me. As fast as I get a good entertainer for that top spot, somebody comes along and murders him." This time it was a failure, Malone said, getting to his feet. He examined the piece of rope he had removed from Oswald McJackson's throat. "Helene, get Annette Guinness here, right away." Helene nodded, her face white as chalk, and darted out the door, closing it after her. "Malone," Jake began desperately, "what do you think?" "I don't think," Malone said laconically. "I know." There was a gentle knock at the door. Jake opened it a crack. It was a waiter, with a whispered message for Malone. "Show the lady to her table," Malone whispered back. "Tell her to order whatever she likes and that I'll be with her as soon as I can." He shut the door again. $2,000 is a lot of dough, Malone said grimly. "But I'm beginning to think I'd have done this for free." Before Jake could ask a question, Helene returned with Annette Guinness. The chorus girl's face was pale under her makeup. She had thrown a coat hastily over her garish costume. She looked at Oswald McJackson and gave a frightened little gasp. "He's all right," Malone said. "He'll come to any minute now." "Malone," Reddick said, "Penn Reddick's outside in the hall." "Ask him in," the lawyer said. "He's paying for this party. He might as well attend it." Penn Reddick came in, stared, and said, "What?" "I'm collecting the rest of my fee," Malone said. He looked at Annette Guinness. "My dear, everything hangs now on two questions I must ask you." He used the same gentle tone he would have applied to a nervous witness in a courtroom. She nodded, her wide, terrified eyes fixed on his face. The very nice young man you married, Malone went on, after the marriage to the midget, which you didn't remember. What was his name? There was the death-like stillness in the room before her lips managed to form the words,
Al Omega?
Malone gave an almost imperceptible start. For a moment he seemed lost in thought. Then he nodded and said, "We'll invite him to this party, too." He opened the door an inch, called to a passing waiter, and said, "Ask Mr. Omega to step in here right away." "Listen," Jake said, "if you think Malone—" "Shut up," Malone said almost absent-mindedly. He waited until Al Omega came into the room before he spoke again. The handsome young orchestra leader said, "You wanted—" caught sight of Oswald McJackson, looked around the room, and said, "Oh, God!" "Yes," Malone said, "another one. But this one lived." He knelt down for a moment beside Oswald and said gently, "How do you feel?" Oswald moaned faintly and moved his head. "What happened?" "That," Malone said, "is what I want you to tell me." He moaned again and put a hand to his throat. "I don't know. I came into the dressing room. Something hit me. I don't know." Malone nodded. There wasn't time for knockout drops in the whiskey tonight. He rose, spied a big towel on the dressing table, wadded it into a pillow, and put it under Oswald McJackson's head. "Just lie there. You'll feel all right in a few minutes." Helene said, "But Malone—" He ignored her. "My other question now, Annette. Last night, someone telephoned all over town to find you, and when finally the call reached you, told you that the midget was dead."
"Yes?"
It was the faintest of whispers. "Now, my dear," he went on, "if you'll tell me who made that telephone call, I'll know everything I need to know. You must have recognized the voice." She stared at him for a moment, while the last color faded from her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came, and then, with a little choking breath, she slid to the floor at his feet. Helene flew to her side, looking accusingly at Malone.
"You didn't need to do that."
"No," Malone said, "because I knew the answer." He looked down at the unconscious girl. "She's been tortured enough," he said very quietly, "and there's nothing more I need to learn from her. Is there a place where she can lie down while we get this over with?" "There's a couch in the chorus girl's dressing room," Jake said. Malone nodded. "You carry her there, Jake. Get someone to look after her. And there are 2 more people I need here, so we'll have a quorum. Send a waiter to bring Lou Goldsmith here from the bar, and get Angela Dahl." During the interval that followed, the little lawyer paced back and forth across the floor, chewing savagely on his cigar, his face gray, not saying a word. Oswald McJackson moaned again, struggled up to the one chair in the room, and sat down heavily, his head resting on his hands. No one else moved. When Jake had returned and Lou Goldsmith and Angela Dahl had arrived, Malone stopped his pacing and stood, half leaning against the dressing table. "Daniel Von Flanagan of the Homicide Division is out front," he began. "I could ask him in to hear this, but I won't. Because what is said in this room tonight is never going to be repeated outside its walls." The words seemed to be forced from him by some great effort. He looked around the room, at Helene standing, pale and motionless, in one corner, at Al Omega, whose forehead glistened with sweat, at the big, thick-shouldered Lou Goldsmith, his eyes dark and tortured, at Oswald McJackson leaning his head on his hand, at Penn Reddick, at the wide-eyed Angela Dahl, at Jake. "I can say that," he began again, "because every person in this room tonight has a good, sound, and entirely private reason for not wanting what is going to be said here to be repeated, anywhere, ever." He looked down at his cigar. "Please be assured, I'm not going to give away those reasons." Jake burst out, "Malone, for the love of Mike, who—" "Don't rush me," Malone said. He looked beyond them all, somewhere into space. "There was a man," he began slowly, "who loved a certain girl very greatly, and who discovered that she was being cruelly victimized by 3 people who were, as someone else has said, The very incarnation of evil. The girl was one of the 12 members of the chorus of the casino. One of the 3 people was another member. He paused for a moment in which everyone in the room looked surreptitiously at Lou Goldsmith. The slot machine king's face was as impassive as concrete. This man, Malone went on in the same dreamy tone, murdered those 3 people by hanging them with silk stockings worn by the chorus girls. But for the 2 men that he murdered, he used only 11 stockings. The woman he murdered was hanged with her own stockings. He drew a long sighing breath. He didn't do that in order to point to the woman's part in the past. Crimes. It wasn't that he wanted the world to know the truth. Rather, it was a strange, fantastic notion of justice. He paused and said, "Of course, he must have been mad," Helene said suddenly.
"No, Malone,"
the lawyer said chidingly. "Yes, Helene. Or at least, if I can't make a jury think so." He puffed at his cigar and looked at Lou Goldsmith. "I hope the offer that you made this afternoon still holds good." Lou Goldsmith nodded and said hoarsely, "Yeah, damn right it still holds good." "Fine," Malone said. He was silent for a moment while he thought over a few details of finance. "Go on, Malone," Jake said. "I'm guessing now," Malone said. "If I don't guess right, I hope someone here will correct me." He crushed out his half-smoked cigar in the ashtray and put his hands in his pockets. "I think that this man put dope in the midget's whiskey bottle here in the dressing room before the show last night. I think that because the dope that was used takes a long time to act. It had to be an expert bit of timing, so that the midget wouldn't collapse until he got back to his dressing room. Then this man came back here and strung up the midget with the stockings he had previously stolen from the chorus girl's dressing room." Oswald McJackson looked up. "You mean Mr. Otto was murdered here?" "Right here," Malone said. "I have the proof of it, from someone who happened in here and saw him." He wondered how Ruth Rawson would look on a witness stand. How he was moved from here has nothing to do with his murder. That's one of the things that will probably never be discovered. He added mentally, "I hope." He began unwrapping a fresh cigar. This morning he traced Mildred Goldsmith to Annette Guinness's apartment. He waited, I think, somewhere outside her apartment, planning to pick up the trail there. But as luck would have it, he saw Annette Guinness leave. So, remember, I'm still guessing, he knocked at the door, and when Mildred Goldsmith let him in, he struck her over the head. The medical report on her will probably show that. I'm saying it because that's the only thing he could have done. Took off her stockings and hung her in Annette Guinness's clothes closet. Then he came to Johnny Oscar. He probably made an appointment with Johnny Oscar, who was probably a pretty nervous man about that time, very likely on the pretext that he had some information for him. They had a drink together, and he doped the drink with the same stuff he had used on the midget, and on one other person. Then the 2 of them went to Johnny Oscar's apartment. Again, the knockout drops must have been very carefully timed. Went in together, and when Johnny Oscar suddenly keeled over, this man strung him up with the other 11 stockings. He bit off the end of the cigar, lit it, and said, "That's all pure guesswork, but I'll bet you any money it's right, because that's the way it must have been."
"Wait," Helene said. "Last night, Annette Guinness, the telephone call."
Malone nodded slowly. "That's my proof," he said. "This man knew that last night Annette Guinness was to go through another meaningless marriage ceremony with a young man who would be held up for a stiff fee for quick, quiet annulment. He knew that the procedure would call for a great deal of night spot visiting. He wanted to prevent that marriage, and so he called up every night spot in town until he managed to catch up with her. Then he told her that the midget was dead." Al Omega said suddenly, "You'll never be able to prove any of this." "I could," Malone said, "by telling the police just what I've been telling you now. But the murderer loves Annette Guinness enough to want to keep this whole story out of the papers. He knows I can give the police proof that won't involve this story. And he knows, too, he said in almost a roar, that he has the best damned lawyer in 7 states, if not the whole civilized world, who can get him off on an insanity plea. He smiled. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this man murdered J. Otto, the Big Midget, and Mildred Goldsmith, and Johnny Oscar because his poor sick brain had conceived the notion that they were persecuting him. You intelligent citizens who are giving your valuable time to serve on a jury, can you honestly believe that a sane man would murder his supposed prosecutors with silk stockings? He paused, mopping his brow, and said, It'll be as easy as that. And God knows the man must have been mad. He wondered how big a fee he could stick Lou Goldsmith for. No, he said very quietly, I don't think that the murderer will give away any secrets, because if he did, he'd have to give away a secret of his own. He knocked a half-inch of ash off his cigar and said, Jake, will you go and ask Von Flanagan to step back here? Jake walked to the door, put a hand on the knob, paused, turned around, and said, Wait a minute. Before we turn this meeting over to the cops, how did you know? What tipped you off? You did, Malone said, examining the end of his cigar. You should have guessed it yourself from what a certain elevator operator told you. Remember? I'm afraid of only one man, and he's closer to me than any other person in the world. Jake stared at him for a moment, blinked, shook his head, and muttered, All right, I'm just a dumb guck. I'll get Von Flanagan. He opened the door and went out. There was a little flurry of movement in the room. Helene ran a hand over her smooth hair, took out a cigarette and lit it. Oswell McJackson moaned and rubbed the back of his neck. Lou Goldsmith fumbled in his pocket for a cigar, found one, looked at it, and put it back. Angela Dahl straightened up and pulled her coat closer around her shoulders. It was a swell show, she said, but why did you drag me in here to watch it? Malone smiled at her admiringly. Because, sweetheart, he said, you're the proof I need. She started to speak. He frowned at her, and she was silent. Luke Goldsmith said suddenly, But how do you know? That, Malone said, is what I'm going to tell Von Flanagan. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Big Midget Murders by Craig Rice. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 32. Jake paused for just a moment at the door leading out front and looked over the casino. Ramon Arriba's band was tearing off an impassioned samba, and the floor was jammed. There didn't seem to be an empty table in the place. He hoped Malone knew what he was doing. Halfway across the room, a gentle voice called to him. Mr. Justus. He wheeled around to see that Max Hook was signaling to him. Feeling in his pocket for a cigarette, he strolled casually up to the table. Good evening. Hope you liked the show. Delightful show, Max Hook said. Don't know when I've enjoyed a show so much, but I didn't ask you over here to tell you how much I liked the show. No, Jake said, as though he didn't have the faintest idea what Max Hook was talking about. No, Max Hook said on the downbeat. You know, I think it's about time for us to talk business, if I may be so coarse, about the casino. Oh, yes, Jake said. Listen, I'll be delighted to talk business with you about 15 minutes from now. Right now, I've something more important to attend to. Do you mind? Mind? Max Hook said, waving his perfumed cigarette. There's nothing I enjoy more than sitting here watching all these charming young people having a good time. Make it whatever time is convenient for you. But, he looked at his wristwatch, make it before 12, Jake, my dear boy, because I'm always in bed by 1. Sure, Jake said, before 12. If Malone did know what he was doing, if he could turn up the murderer of the Midget and Mildred Goldsmith and Johnny Oscar, then it would be possible to keep Von Flanagan from closing the casino. But Max Hook was another matter. Malone wanted to see him backstage, Jake explained to Von Flanagan. The big police officer finished his drink, cast a last wistful glance at the dancers on the floor, and followed Jake. Malone was outside the dressing room talking to a waiter. As Jake opened the door for Von Flanagan, he heard the little lawyer say, "Tell her I'll be with her in just a few minutes. Does she have everything she wants?"
"Oh, yes, Mr. Malone," the waiter assured him. "And she's talking with Mr. Bullock."
Jake thought that Malone's face paled as he said, "You don't mean Harrison Bullock, the broker?"
"Oh, yes, sir,"
the waiter said. Jake grabbed Malone by the arm. "With all the girls there are in the world," he began indignantly. "You were too young to see the Follies," Malone said, "back in 22. "Damn you," Jake said. "Listen, Malone, there's some trouble." "Another murder?" Malone asked pleasantly. "Worse. Max Hook wants his dough back." Malone chewed his lower lip. "When?" "Now." "Well," Malone said, "we've met everything else. We can meet this somehow. How much do you owe him?" "Only $3,500, Jake said. "But I can't take that out of the casino receipts. What with—" Malone said quickly. "Never mind." He was thinking fast. There was that check from Penn Reddick in his wallet for $2,000. There would be another check from Penn Reddick for $1,800, if he was guessing right about the midget's murderer. "Never mind," he repeated. "We can meet it." He'd still have a few $100s left to spend on Ruth Rawson. "Oh, sure," Jake said bitterly. "We'll meet it. We meet everything." He opened the door for Malone, his heart sick. Helene smiled at him from across the dressing room. That didn't help much either. She was pale and tired, and still smiling. "I wanted to make this place a success for you," he tried to tell her with his eyes. Von Flanagan had stopped dead in his tracks in the middle of the room, staring about him. "What the hell is this?" he asked suspiciously. "Just a little quiet celebration," Malone said, smiling. "To celebrate my handing over to you the murderer of the midget and Mildred Goldsmith and Johnny Oscar." The smile faded from his face. "I hate to do this, Von Flanagan," he said, "because the guy's crazy. He didn't have a reason in the world for committing the murders except that his poor, sick brain cooked up a notion that they were persecuting him." Von Flanagan had heard Malone talking to juries in the past. He said, "Yeah?" and looked around the room. "Which one is it?" "Imagine a sane man," Malone went on, "drugging his victims and then strangling them with silk stockings. Imagine the conflict that must have been going on in his poor, tortured mind. Think of it, Von Flanagan." "Let a jury think of it," Von Flanagan said. "I'm just a cop." He paused, shook his head, and murmured, "The guy must have been nuts." "That's what I've been trying to tell you," Malone said. "Okay," Von Flanagan said. "Maybe I'd better call a squad car." "You won't need one," Malone said. "He'll go quietly." Von Flanagan said, "I'll take your word for it. But which one?" "Do you mean you don't know?" Malone said in a hurt, surprised voice. Von Flanagan's eyes followed Malone's. "You're nuts," he said. "He has an alibi." "The alibi," Malone told him, "is what proves I'm right." He turned to Angela Dahl. "My dear, before you left the casino last night, did you have a drink?" She nodded. "Several drinks." "Here, in this room?" She nodded again. "Yes," he said. "It would be all right. There was a bottle of scotch." "And then you went home," the lawyer went on. "Do you remember what happened after you got home?"
"Well," she paused, "Ruth Rawson called me up. I remember that, but I don't remember much else."
"No," Malone said, "because you'd been doped with the same drug that laid out the midget. I know because you woke up this morning feeling swell, and then all of a sudden you passed out cold as a clam. The dope that was given to the midget worked that way." He turned to Von Flanagan. "There goes the alibi. She doesn't know what time she went to sleep last night. And who in the world would be able to whip up a drug like that except a man who studied to be a chemistry professor?" Oswald McJackson struggled to his feet. "Wait," Malone said. He went on mercilessly. "At the last minute he decided to save himself. So he faked a murder attempt in which he was to have been the intended victim." He picked up the strand of rope from the floor and handed it to Von Flanagan. "Only when he frayed the rope so that it would break and drop him to the floor unharmed, he had to use a razor on a few of the strands."
"Wait,"
Oswald McJackson said. "The poor, helpless madman," Malone said. "There isn't a jury in the world who would send him to the chair." Oswald McJackson stared helplessly around the room, at Von Flanagan, at Malone. "I must have been. I was crazy." "Was?" Malone said. "You are." He walked up to the stricken man and laid a hand on his arm. "I'll confess," Oswald McJackson said. "I'll confess everything." "You do," Malone told him, "and I'll break your neck. Don't you dare say one damned word unless I'm dictating it. What do you have a lawyer for?" He tightened the hand on Oswald's arm. "Don't worry, pal. When I get you before a jury, I'll save you from the chair." Author's note. He did, too. "A damn shame," Von Flanagan rumbled. "He was a swell magician." "He was a lousy magician," Malone said, "and a worse actor. That phony feint of his here tonight would have tipped off anybody with a discerning eye. A man who's just missed being hung by the snap of a rope doesn't lie peacefully on the floor with his eyes closed." He took out a fresh cigar. Von Flanagan took the giant by one unprotesting arm. "Come along, Professor. While you're waiting trial, maybe you can teach me that coin and glass of water trick." He walked to the door with his prisoner, everyone in the room watching and trying to pretend that he wasn't. At the door, he paused and turned around. "How the hell did you know, Malone?" "An elevator operator told Jake," Malone said. He unwrapped the cigar. He had overheard something the midget said once. It was... He paused, squinted at the ceiling, and quoted, "I'm afraid of only one man, and he's closer to me than any other person in the world." He lit the cigar, slowly and with exquisite care. "For a while, I thought that meant someone else. Then I realized who was closer to the midget than Oswald McJackson, who stooged for him in his act, and drove his car, and put him to bed at night, and got him up in the morning, and looked after his accounts, and read his mail." He looked thoughtfully at the end of the cigar. "And who was as much a giant as J. Otto was a midget. They were closer than brothers." He met Helene's eyes across the room in a casual glance. "That's how I knew." Oswald McJackson laughed hoarsely. For a moment, Malone wondered if his analysis of the case had been right. "Come on, Professor," Von Flanagan said gently. The door closed behind him. Malone slumped down against the dressing table. "I guess that ends the show," he said. Suddenly he looked up, a half smile on his face. "I could have given another proof if I had needed to. The thing I've been trying to remember and couldn't." He glanced up at the bar over the closet. Helene had a dream about Oswald McJackson in a magician's cloak saying, "I couldn't have done this trick if I hadn't been 12 feet tall."
"That's it," Helene said excitedly. "That's the thing I've been trying to think of."
Malone interrupted her. "There wasn't any chair in this dressing room when the midget was hung. Jake's a fairly tall man, yet he couldn't have reached up to that bar where the noose was tied. Only a man as tall as Oswald McJackson could have done it. We should have guessed that hours ago." Suddenly he looked very tired. "Will you call a waiter, Jake? I want to send a message." He ran a hand over his face, covering his eyes for just one moment. Penn Reddick had been bending over the dressing table, busy with a fountain pen. Now he straightened up and handed a check to Malone.
"I guess that squares us,"
he said. Malone stuck the check in his pocket without looking at it. "I guess it does," he said. He smiled. "Betty Royal's out front. Now that you've got the midget off your mind, there's no other reason why you can't manage a proposal, is there?"
"Not a reason in the world,"
Penn Reddick said. He put his fountain pen back in his pocket and ducked out the door. Angela Dahl pulled her furs around her shoulders.
"I guess there'll be pictures when the story breaks tomorrow," she said. "Maybe I'd better go and get a good night's sleep."
"You'd better," Jake said, "and have a facial before the reporters get to you." She smiled wanly.
"Leave it to me,"
she said, and was gone. Then Lou Goldsmith roused himself from what had seemed almost to be a trance. "What I said still goes, Malone," he rumbled. "Defend the guy, and send me the bill." He picked up his hat, stood silent by the door for a moment, waved a good night, and took his leave. The waiter Jake had called arrived at the door. Malone stepped outside to whisper to him. "Tell Miss Ralston I'll be with her in just a few minutes now. Is she having a good time?"
"Yes, sir," the waiter said. "Yes, sir, she's having a very good time. She's still chatting with Mr. Bullock, sir."
"Damn Mr. Bullock," Malone said, stepping back into their dressing room.
"Annette,"
Al Omega said. "She never was married to the midget," Malone said. "The marriage certificate he showed her was a fake. She'd had a hell of a time, and she needs a good strong arm around her. Her husband's, for instance."
"Thanks,"
Al Omega said. He paused at the door.
"You know, Mildred Goldsmith."
"I know," Malone said. "She didn't mean a thing. She ran after you. You were sore and hurt because you couldn't understand why Annette had left you the day after your marriage. You didn't give a hoot in hell about Mildred Goldsmith, but she was available. And then the midget confided in you about his fake marriage to Annette, only he didn't tell you it was a fake. And Mildred confided in you that Annette was working this marriage annulment game, only she didn't tell you it was someone else's idea, not Annette's. And you couldn't guess that the midget had put her up to it." The little lawyer shook his head. He didn't miss a trick. He saw how tortured Annette was when she saw you with Mildred Goldsmith. He saw how tortured Lou Goldsmith was when he saw Mildred with you. And he saw how tortured you were when you believed Annette was a grafting little gold digger with a new approach. He picked up his cigar. "At least I'm glad you two came out of it with your skins whole."
"Thanks,"
Al Omega said. He opened the door and said,
"I'll look after Annette."
"He will, too," Jake said after the door was closed. "He's a good guy." Malone stared at the closed door. "I should have guessed."
"After all," Helene said gently, "no one even pretends you're psychic in addition to your other talents."
At Jake's questioning look, she went on,
"Oh, Malone thought the nice young man Annette had married was Oswald McJackson."
"It was the logical conclusion," Malone said. "But as a matter of fact, it all fitted together better this way. Remind me never to trust logical conclusions again." He lit his cigar. "Well," he said, "that winds up damn near everything."
"No, it doesn't," Helene said. "I still don't understand about those silk stockings."
Malone passed his hand warily over his eyes. "I explained it. There were 11 because he wanted to use Mildred Goldsmith's own stockings on her."
"That isn't what I mean," Helene said. "Why use stockings at all?"
"Revenge, symbolism, making the punishment fit the crime," Malone shrugged. "Remember, these murders were committed by a man who considered them acts of vengeance, not for the wrongs he had suffered himself, but because of other people. You've heard enough about the midget's exotic personal life to realize that every member of the casino chorus, except Mildred Goldsmith, could have killed him with pleasure." He sighed. "Well, Oswald fixed it so they practically did. That boy sure has a sense of justice." Jake said, "Smart, too. He almost stumped you, Malone, for the first time." Malone thought for a moment, then said, "There's always just one key thing you need to know. The key that unlocks a door, or a mystery, or—" He paused suddenly, staring at them. "A fiddle case."
"Yes," Helene said excitedly. "A fiddle case. Malone, who moved the midget's body and why?"
"Do you know?" Jake put in. The little lawyer nodded. "Yes, I know. And I'll tell you in a minute. Jake, get Artie Clute in here." End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Big Midget Murders by Craig Rice. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 33. For just a moment, while Jake went to get the bass fiddle player, Malone permitted himself the luxury of thinking about Ruth Ralston. She'd be there waiting for him right at this very instant. The Snow Queen of that 20 years ago ballet, all in dazzling white save for the red gold hair that flowed over her pale arms like a flame. Just a few minutes now. "I don't feel as old as I look," he told himself. "And by golly, I bet I don't look as old as I feel."
"What are you muttering about?" Helene asked.
She lit a cigarette with fingers that still trembled. "Truth," he told her solemnly. "Truth is the key that unlocks all doors. And all fiddle cases." Helene said sternly,
Malone, you're drunk.
Not yet, I'm not, he told her happily. But what if he did have to turn over most of the fee he had gotten from Pin Reddick to square Jake with Max Hook? He'd get it back from Jake later. Meantime, Ruth Rawlson was waiting for him. He could hear Artie Clute protesting by the time Jake had dragged him within 6 feet of the dressing room door.
Honest, Mr. Justus, just a couple of quick ones before the show tonight. You know how it is. Standing up there, beating that old bass fiddle. Nothing to look at but the pretty girls in the chorus. A guy gets bored.
He came in through the dressing room door on the last word, looking around, and turned white. You're not going to get fired, Malone said sternly. You're not going to have to talk to a cop. You're not in any trouble. But, he drew a long breath, why in hell did you carry the little guy out of here last night?
I didn't know I was,
Artie Clute said, his round face unhappy.
Honest, Mr. Malone, I thought... Say, Mr. Malone, how the hell did you know?
Truth, Malone said gravely, is the key that... He paused, cleared his throat, and said, Nobody could have gotten the midget's body out of the fiddle case without having a key to the case. There was one key, the one the midget had, and it was... He paused. Not available. So another key must have been used, and nobody in the world would have had that extra key to the fiddle case except the man who owned it. Artie Clute said,
Gee, I didn't mean to do anything wrong.
He sniffed, like a small boy staving off the tears.
After all, hell, it had been my fiddle case, and if I couldn't get it back, Al Omega wouldn't give me my job again, and I owed $16 at the hotel and $4 at the liquor store, and the...
So you did carry him out of here, Jake said. Artie Clute scratched the underside of his nose with the back of his forefinger.
After Al Omega told me I could have my junk back, I thought I'd come in and try to make some kind of deal with the midget, so I came back here and knocked on the door, and then I came in and he wasn't here. But there was the fiddle case leaning up against the wall. So I thought, what the hell, I'll take it along with me and make a deal with him later. What would you have done?
Exactly the same thing, Jake said calmly.
So I took it back to my place at the hotel, and I got my key and opened it, and, geez, instead of my fiddle, there's a dead midget. He looked up appealingly. Can you imagine how I felt about that? We can imagine, Helene said, easily. So I thought, geez, what the hell am I going to do with this? And I decided I'd better have a drink, only all I had left was 40 cents, so I went over to the drugstore where you can buy a under-the-counter pint for 40 cents. He shuddered reminiscently. So I drank about half of it, and then I began to feel sorry as hell for the little guy. Here he was, and not even in his own bed. So I drank the rest of the pint, and then I went through his pockets and found the key to his apartment, and took him down there and undressed him and put him to bed just as nicely and carefully as I could. He sniffed again. Honest, I meant to fold his hands, but I'm afraid I forgot to.
Don't apologize, Malone said hoarsely. You did a beautiful job. And I suppose you called up the desk and left a 7:30 call for him, too? Artie Clute nodded.
Was that wrong?
He asked anxiously. No, Malone said, but I hope you didn't think he'd hear it. The bass fiddle player looked indignant.
Do you think I'm dumb?
He turned appealingly to Jake and Helene.
I thought if I left a call for him, when he didn't answer, somebody would go up and see what was wrong. You wouldn't have wanted to leave that poor little guy there all by himself and nobody to come up and find him, would you? Perish the thought, Helene said.
Artie Clute smiled at her.
And then I meant to take the fiddle case back to the casino and find the fiddle itself, but, geez, I began to feel groggy as hell, so I decided just to take the case back to the casino. And then I felt too groggy for that, so I finally thought, well, Mr. Justus owns the casino, so I took the fiddle case up and leaned it against your door. And I guess I got to bed all right after that, because that's where I woke up this morning.
He looked anxiously at Jake.
You don't think I've done wrong, do you?
No, Jake said, dragging it out.
That's swell,
Artie Clute said, brightening up. He scratched his nose again and said,
I gotta get back out there, or I'll be in trouble again, Mr. Justus. Have a heart. Please don't tell on me. I don't want to lose my job again.
I wouldn't dream of it, Jake said.
That's wonderful of you, Artie Clute told him. And I want you to know I appreciate it, because if Al Omega knew I'd been drinking that 40-cent whiskey again, he'd...
He started to open the door. Wait a minute, Malone said. I thought you meant you didn't want any of us to tell you'd carried the midget's body out of here in your fiddle case.
That? Artie Clute said. Who the hell would care about that?
He stared at them and said,
Sure, I won't tell anybody about that, because if I did, I'd have to tell about that 40-cent liquor. And then Al Omega would fire me again, and I couldn't let that happen because I just borrowed $10 tonight from the head waiter and put up my fiddle for security.
He opened the door, started out, and said,
Oh, Mr. Justus, I bought a suit of your clothes on time payments this afternoon and forged your name as a reference. I hope you don't mind.
The strains of Ramon Arriba's closing theme came in from the bandstand. Artie Clute said,
Gotta go, goodbye,
and closed the door. Well, Jake said at last, he is a damn fine bass fiddle player. He glanced around the room and said, let's get out of here. The three left the dressing room without a backward glance. Back in the casino, Malone strained his eyes to see in the farthest corner 2 figures with their heads together. One of the figures wore a white dress. Well, he'd chase that Bullock guy away fast enough, even if he did own half the real estate on the near north side. Surely Ruth Ralston wouldn't mind having been kept waiting for such a little while. Now, Jake said in an undertone to Malone, one thing more, Max Hook. As Malone nodded, he seated Helene at the table they had left such a short time before, leaned over her, and said, You'll excuse us for a minute. Business. She had never looked more beautiful, her pale hair smooth and gleaming around her face, her lovely eyes violet-edged with weariness. As they threaded their way through the tables, Malone felt for the reassuring crackle of the checks in his pocket. The office rent could go for another month. That little matter at the bank could be taken care of. Apologetic Notes could handle those February and March bills in his desk drawer. There would be the fee for Oswald McJackson's defense coming along. No, he didn't really need the money Penn Reddick had given him. Max Hook looked up and smiled at them blandly.
Sorry to trouble you, Jake, my dear boy. Will you join me in a drink? No? Very well. Shall we get right down to business?
Sure, Jake said. Let's get it over with. Max Hook glanced around as though to make sure no one was listening.
Jake, my boy, I let you have the use of certain money to remodel and redecorate the casino. You put up the casino as security. Frankly, my dear fellow, I don't want the casino, but...
He paused. Malone thought, here it comes. He felt again for the checks.
Also, frankly, Max Hook whispered, I don't want the money either, but I'd be glad to cancel the debt.
Again he looked cautiously around. Malone withdrew his hand from his pocket and thought, what the hell?
Jake, my dear young friend, Max Hook said, I'll be glad to call it square if... The midget? I understand he has some pictures in his room.
He cleared his throat.
If you can arrange it, I'd be glad. I'd be delighted to take those pictures instead of the money or the casino.
Jake stared at him and said hoarsely, It might be arranged.
Good, my dear boy,
Max Hook murmured. He fitted a thin cigarette into his rose quartz holder, leaned against the table, and breathed.
Are those pictures really as...
Halfway back to his own table, Jake said to Malone, I knew I'd find a use for those pictures sometime. Malone glanced at him. It was as though the weight of the world had dropped from Jake's shoulders. He watched while Jake sat down beside Helene, took one of her slender hands in his, and brushed his lips over the fingertips. He looked up towards the bandstand, where Al Omega had just appeared, bright-eyed and smiling, keeping one eye on the table near the door where Annette Guinness sat watching him adoringly. He started across the floor and past Betty Royal's table, her basketball team of admirers gone, and Penn Reddick at her side, just in time to hear Penn Reddick saying, There's a reason why I couldn't tell you before, but now... He glanced at his watch. Oh, well, Ruth Ralston had only been waiting a little over 2 hours. He threaded his way through the crowd to her table. It was empty. There was a little litter of cigarette stubs and empty glasses which a busy waiter was rapidly clearing away. Miss Ralston? Malone said with a sudden anxiety in his voice.
Miss Ralston. Oh, yes, Mr. Malone. She left a message for you.
Malone said, Left?
Miss Rawson left just a few minutes ago," the waiter said, "with Mr. Bullock. She asked me to tell you they were driving to Crown Point to be married, sir."
He sighed.
"Oh, very lucky young lady, if I may say so. Mr. Bullock—"
"I know," Malone said hoarsely. He stood there for just a minute looking at the deserted table. Then, "Tell me, how did she look?" The waiter rolled his eyes heavenward.
"Beautiful, sir. Simply beautiful. She wore a white dress trimmed with, I believe they're called gold nail heads, sir. And her hair, frankly, sir, I've never seen more gorgeous hair. Like red sunshine it was, I give you my word. And her face, Mr. Malone, was like the face of an angel."
"It was, eh?" Malone said. "I hope they'll be very happy." He handed the waiter a $5 bill. The waiter stared at it, and at Malone.
"What's this for, sir?"
"Never mind," Malone said. "You wouldn't understand." He took one more glance at the table, strolled out past the bar, through the lobby, and into the street. Well, 20 years from now, perhaps. He hailed a passing taxi, yawned, and climbed in. "Home," said John J. Malone. End of chapter 33. And end of The Big Midget Murders by Craig Rice. Read by Ben Tucker.